PEC Education is one of the leading PTE test preparation centers in Dhaka, Bangladesh. PEC provides online and on-campus PTE preparation with authentic study materials and practice PTE mock tests.
So this, of course, is the Shard, London's tallest building, and we might even say London's new symbol. It's worth studying not just for the way it blends into the London skyline, but because several new engineering techniques were pioneered when it was built. One was the so-called top-down construction, which basically means that the foundations were dug and the concrete centre of the building was put up at the same time, at least as far as the 23rd storey. This reduced the construction time by 3 months. Although this wasn't an entirely new thing, it had certainly never been used for a skyscraper before. Then there was the use of the building's permanent lift shaft during construction, with the lift jumping higher as the building became taller. That was thought to be the best way to transport people and materials up and down, rather than using any outside construction. And I should also mention the spire, which gives the famous shattered glass appearance. Rather than being lifted up in one piece, it was assembled 300 metres in the air at the top of the building.
The Shard is London's tallest building and a number of new engineering techniques were used in its construction. The foundations were dug at the same time as the concrete centre of the building was put up, which had never been done with a skyscraper before. Another innovation was that the building's lift shaft was used to take people and materials up and down during construction. Finally, the spire at the top was assembled over the building at a height of 300 metres.
It wasn't until the late 15th century that composers really gave much attention to instrumental music. Before that, vocal music was most common, and instruments were really treated just as an accompaniment to singers. Instruments were played really just as a guide for the singer's benefit. It was only in the late 15th century that instruments were seen as having real musical potential of their own. Composers started to produce music for them, and to write background parts for songs which didn't just repeat the singer's notes. There were several reasons for this change, one of which has to be the refinements that were made to the instruments themselves. If we look at keyboard instruments, for example, organs had been around since classical times, but by the late 1400s they had become much more sophisticated. Another reason was the popularity of dancing. Dances were becoming more intricate. A number of new ones became popular, and of course they all needed instrumental music to accompany them.
Before the late 15th century, vocal music was far more important than instrumental music. Instruments were mainly used to accompany singers and they played the same notes that were sung. From the late 15th century, however, much more instrumental music was written. Two reasons for this were that instruments, such as the organ, had undergone many improvements, and that new dances became popular.
When something you order arrives on your doorstep, do you ever think about the journey it took to get there? That book you ordered online, or that new dining table, everything that arrives in your home started somewhere else, often somewhere a long way away. And the companies that send these products to us need to put a lot of thought into how they transport their goods to our homes. In the past, cost and speed were the main factors in this decision-making. If companies needed products to arrive very quickly, they would be likely to choose to transport them by air. When time was less of a concern, or if cost was the primary concern, companies would usually have their goods transported by ship across the sea, or on trains across land. While cost and speed of delivery are still major factors in a company's decision-making, the environmental impact of different modes of transport has become a major influence too. Companies are now choosing water and rail transport, not just because they are cheaper, but because these methods of transport do not damage the environment so much as air travel.
Companies used to primarily consider cost and speed when deciding what method of transport to use for shipping goods. Although these two factors are still very important, the environmental impact of transporting goods has now become another major factor in the decision-making process, with some companies choosing rail and sea ahead of air due to the damaging effect of air travel on the environment.
In addition to research about the effects climate change has on the natural environment, its impact on human health has become an expanding domain of academic study. It has been recognized that there are mental health and well-being implications of climate change, mainly due to how individuals feel about the issue. These concerns can be categorized into two main groups, namely the distress caused by the impacts of environmental change on lifestyle and livelihood, such as droughts affecting harvests, and secondly, a sense of losing emotional attachment to places of personal importance, which could, for example, involve a person's birthplace becoming unrecognizable due to physical change. The detrimental health and well-being effects associated with climate change disproportionately affect those living in remote rural areas, especially farmers. And unfortunately, accessing health care in these places can be very difficult for the people who may most need it.
Research has found that climate change can have a negative impact on people's health and well-being, as well as on the natural environment. People can suffer from a loss of livelihood as well as a loss of attachment to place due to the impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, the people most likely to experience these negative effects personally are also often the least likely to be able to access healthcare.
Historically, women have been underrepresented in STEM subjects, that is, studies in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These remain areas offering successful graduates attractive career prospects in the globalized market, as they are prestigious and often have high-level entry salaries. If we look at science and engineering, here we see the number of women being encouraged to enter these fields, maintaining a steady growth with figures for female graduates remaining consistent. So, while some areas are hitting the targets set, this is still not the case in technology. And while companies may voice the desire to address the gender imbalance, the reality is that there is still an insufficient number of qualified women to take up positions both in management and as software developers to level the playing field. Yet, women are continuing to make up more of this labour force. Attitudes are constantly being reshaped. And with this more optimistic outlook, there is every chance of narrowing the gender gap in the future.
Women have been underrepresented in the STEM subjects, which lead to prestigious careers and higher salaries, and while the numbers of women in science and engineering are growing steadily and meeting targets, this is not true yet for technology. Companies say they are willing to address the imbalance, but there are not enough women to take these professional positions. However, there is optimism that the situation is changing and that the gap will be narrower in the future.